The men said she would be dead before the first real snow. They said the iron box would freeze her from the inside out. They said a widow had no business living alone on a mountain where even strong men broke under winter. But on the night the sky turned the color of bruised steel, Margaret Gable closed the door of that rail car from the inside, and she did not look afraid. Up in the Sierra Nevada mountains, where the air thinned and the wind carried the smell of pine and stone, an abandoned freight car sat on a crooked spur of track that led nowhere. The railroad company had folded years before. The tracks ended in mid-air above a steep drop. The car had no windows, just iron walls scarred by rust and time. To most folks passing through, it looked like scrap metal waiting to be swallowed by snow. To Margaret, it was home. She arrived with no wagon train, no sons, no husband riding ahead on horseback. Only a large German shepherd named Kaiser and a trunk filled with wool blankets. The mining camp 3 miles down the slope was alive with noise that fall. Hammers struck wood. Men hauled timber. Women packed mud into cracks between logs. Everyone was preparing for winter, the only way they knew how. Build bigger. Burn more. Pray harder. Margaret did none of that. Instead of stacking cords of firewood, she hauled sacks of dirt into the rail car. Instead of raising a stone chimney, she dragged river stones up the hill one by one. From a distance, she looked like grief had taken her mind. A widow working inside a metal coffin. If you have ever seen someone build something others do not understand, you know the look they get. The quiet stares, at the shaking heads, the whispers that follow them like smoke. Margaret heard all of it. She kept working. Inside the rail car, the iron floor was so cold it bit through her boots. The walls held the chill of last winter, as if they had never thawed. When the wind struck the metal, it groaned like an old ship lost at sea. But she did not try to heat the whole space. She measured 8 feet at the very back. 8 feet would be enough. She built a thick wooden wall across the width of the car. Then she built another one behind it. Between those 2 walls, she packed dry pine needles and sheep's wool she had gathered from fences down in the valley. She pressed it tight with her hands until there was no space left for wind to move. She was not building a room. She was building a pocket where warmth could stay. One afternoon, a miller from the mining camp climbed the slope with 2 other men. Their boots crunched on frozen gravel. Their breath hung white in the air. He leaned against his shovel and laughed when he saw her hauling another sack inside. "You can't hide from winter in a tin box," he called out. Margaret climbed down slowly. Her hands were raw from rope burns. Dirt streaked her cheeks. "I'm not hiding," she said. "I'm preparing." He told her the iron would pull the heat out of her bones, that she would freeze before Christmas, that she should come down to the bunkhouse where the fire never went out. She listened. Then she shook her head. A big fire eats wood like a hungry beast, and she had no one to cut trees for her. She only had what she could carry. If you are still with me, you might already feel what she understood that day. Why winter was not something you defeated with noise. It was something you survived with patience. The sky above the peaks had begun to change. The blue had faded into a dull gray that pressed down on the mountains. Elk were moving lower earlier than usual. Even Kaiser lifted his head at night, ears stiff, sensing something heavy in the air. Margaret noticed everything. She laid branches across the iron floor, creating a raised layer. Between them she poured ash and dry sand. On top of that, she placed old boards she had pried from a broken crate. When she stood on it, the cold no longer climbed straight into her legs. Then she turned to the walls. Instead of nailing wood directly against the iron, she hung thick canvas several inches away from it. Behind that canvas, she stuffed more wool and dry grass. She left a narrow space of still air between the iron skin and her inner room. She was breaking the path the cold would travel. Most people thought warmth came only from fire. Margaret knew warmth could also come from slowing loss. At night, she built a raised bed frame, not for comfort, but because cold air settles low. Beneath that bed, she stacked heavy river stones. During the day, she heated them outside in a small fire. At night, they released their stored warmth slowly, like the earth holding on to the memory of sunlight. The miners laughed when they saw her carrying stones. They did not laugh long. As November deepened, the air sharpened. Frost crept across the railcar each morning, painting the metal white. Inside her 8-foot room, the air began to feel different. Still, quiet, held. But she sealed cracks with a paste made from flour and ash. She built a thick door layered with wool blankets stretched across a wooden frame. When she closed it, the sounds of the empty railcar faded into a distant hollow echo. For the first time since her husband had died, she felt something close to control. Not over fate, not over loss, but over this small square of space. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the peaks and the temperature fell fast, she sat on her bed. Kaiser rested his heavy head on her knee. The iron walls outside the partition snapped as they cooled. Inside her pocket, it was calm. She looked at the small thermometer hanging beside her bed. It held steady. Outside, the wind began to rise. And far down the slope, in the mining camp where fires were already burning high, well, men did not yet realize how much wood they would need. Margaret did, because she was not trying to fight the mountain. She was waiting for it to make its move. The storm did not arrive with thunder. It arrived with silence. On a Tuesday evening, the wind stopped without warning. The trees stood still. The birds vanished. Even the creek below the ridge sounded muted, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Margaret stepped outside the railcar and looked west. The sky was thick and pale, stretched tight over the peaks. She had seen that color once before, the winter her husband never came back from a supply run. That same heavy stillness had settled over the valley before the world turned white. She went back inside and shut the sliding iron door. If you have ever felt a storm coming before the first drop falls, but you know that feeling in your chest, that quiet warning that tells you something bigger than you is on its way. She added one small log to her tin stove and waited. The first snowflake touched the railcar roof like a whisper, then another. Within an hour, the world disappeared. Snow fell thick and fast, not drifting, but driving sideways, pushed by a wind that came screaming down the pass. The iron walls began to howl under the force. The sound was sharp and violent, like metal being struck again and again. Inside the main body of the railcar, frost began to spread across the floor in silver veins. But behind her wooden partition, Margaret wrapped a single wool blanket around her shoulders and checked the thermometer. 62 degrees. Kaiser lay stretched at her feet, breathing slow and steady. Down in the mining camp, the first cabin door blew open before midnight. The men rushed to brace it with timber. The wind forced its way through every crack in the chinking. Fires roared inside stone hearths, flames leaping high, but the heat fled straight up the chimneys. Wood disappeared fast. Too fast. By morning, the temperature had dropped to 30 below zero. Water froze in buckets near the walls. Blankets turned stiff near door frames. Faces nearest the fire burned hot, while backs froze in shadow. They fed entire logs into the flames just to keep from shaking. Up on the ridge, snow began to pile against the railcar. It buried the wheels first, then the lower walls. Then, halfway up the iron sides, the shrieking wind battered the metal shell. Any other person might have panicked at the sound. Margaret did not. She sat cross-legged on her bed and placed her hand beneath the blanket, touching one of the river stones. It was warm, not blazing, not roaring, just steady. Every 6 hours, she added a small piece of oak to the stove, not to chase the cold away, but to replace only what had slipped through her layers. She was not fighting the storm. She was balancing it. Stay with me, because what happened next would change how that entire mountain survived winter forever. By the second day, the railcar was almost fully buried. What the snow did something unexpected. It quieted everything. The violent shriek of the wind softened into a low, muffled hum. The snow wrapped around the iron like thick insulation. It blocked the worst of the cold air from striking the metal directly. The storm that was killing cabins below was now sealing her shelter tighter. Inside her 8-foot room, the air remained dry. The small vent she had built drew in fresh oxygen because warm air rose and pulled new air gently inward. The pipe was angled just enough to keep snow from clogging it. She brushed Kaiser's coat slowly, listening to the storm outside fade into distant pressure. For the first time since her husband died, she did not feel hunted by the world. She felt prepared. On the third night, the mining camp ran low on wood. 2 men tried to reach the shared pile in the whiteout. One returned with frostbitten fingers. The other stumbled back, disoriented, barely able to speak. Cabin roofs began to sag under the weight of snow. Fear moved through the camp like a second storm. Miller stood near the largest fire, sweat on his brow, ice in his beard. He remembered the widow in the iron rail car. He shook his head at the thought. No one could survive up there. Not in metal. Not alone. By the 5th day, the blizzard still had not stopped. The railcar had vanished completely beneath a mountain of white. Only the tip of the stovepipe remained above the drift, a thin thread of smoke rising into the gray sky. Inside, Margaret's thermometer read 58 degrees. She was wearing a simple sweater. Kaiser snored softly. She rationed her wood carefully, and 3 small pieces per day. No more. Her stones held the warmth like living things. She read from an old Bible by the faint glow of the stove vent. She sipped melted snow warmed gently in a tin cup. She felt no rush, no panic, just rhythm. Outside, men were burning through their winter supply in a single week. Inside, she had months left. On the 7th morning, the storm finally broke. Sunlight returned sharp and bright, reflecting off endless waves of white. The mining camp looked battered. 2 cabins had partially collapsed. The woodpile was nearly gone. Miller gathered a small group of men. They did not say it out loud, but they were going up the ridge to recover a body. The climb was brutal. Snow reached their waists in places. Their breath came hard in the thin air. When they reached the spur, they saw nothing at first, just a smooth white hill. Then one of the men pointed. A thin line of smoke rose from the snow like a signal. Miller stared at it, confused. "That's not possible," he muttered. They began to dig. Their shovels struck iron with a dull clang. They cleared enough snow to reach the sliding door and forced it open. A wave of bitter cold rushed out from the empty body of the rail car. "Margaret!" Miller called into the darkness. No answer. He stepped carefully inside, boots ringing on frozen steel. At the far end, he saw the wooden partition. He swallowed. He thought he was walking toward a coffin. Then the small inner door opened, and a wave of warm air touched his face. It smelled like pine and wool. Margaret stood there, cheeks pink, eyes steady. Kaiser stepped forward with a low, welcoming bark. But Miller could not speak for a moment. The heat from the small room wrapped around him like sunlight. Behind Margaret, the stove glowed gently. Beneath her bed, the stones radiated quiet warmth. "You're warm," he whispered. And in that moment, everything he believed about surviving winter began to crack. Miller stood in that small wooden doorway longer than he meant to. The heat from Margaret's shelter touched his frozen skin and made it sting. His boots dripped melted snow onto her raised floor. Behind him, the other men crowded close, their breath uneven, their faces gray with exhaustion. Inside that 8-foot space, the air felt alive. Not heavy, not smoky, just steady and warm. Margaret stepped aside without a word. One by one, the men entered. They filled the tiny room quickly. Their shoulders brushed the canvas-lined walls. Their eyes moved from the small stove to the thick wooden bulkhead, then down to the stones beneath the bed. One of the younger miners knelt and placed his palm against a river stone. "It's warm," he said softly, almost like a child discovering fire for the first time. Margaret nodded. "It holds what you give it," she replied. Miller looked back toward the empty body of the rail car. Frost clung to the iron walls just a few feet away. The contrast was almost impossible to understand. "You didn't burn much," he said, staring at the small pile of remaining wood stacked neatly in the corner. "No," Margaret answered. "I only replaced what I lost." The men exchanged glances. Down in the camp, they had burned through nearly everything. Whole trees had disappeared into roaring fires that gave comfort for an hour and demanded more by morning. Here, the fire was quiet, controlled, patient. Miller removed his gloves slowly. His hands trembled as feeling returned to his fingers. He looked at Margaret, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "We thought you were burying yourself," he admitted. Margaret's expression did not change. "I was," she said calmly. "I let the snow bury the iron. The snow keeps the worst of the cold away." The men were silent. Outside, the mountain glittered under sharp sunlight. Inside, warmth rested in the room like a living thing. "Stay with me, because what happened after that visit changed more than just one winter." The miners did not stay long. Pride still sat heavy in their chests. But before they left, each one studied the walls, the layered canvas, the sealed seams, the raised bed. They asked questions. Margaret answered without boasting. She explained the air gap between iron and wood. She showed them how the stovepipe ran sideways before exiting, keeping heat inside longer. She spoke about using small, steady heat instead of roaring flames. When they stepped back into the frozen rail car and then out into the blinding white, they carried more than warmth with them. They carried an idea. That spring, when the snow finally melted and the valley turned green again, the mining camp did not rebuild the same way. Cabins were repaired, yes, but inside those cabins, smaller inner rooms began to appear. Double walls, packed with dry grass, raised sleeping platforms, stone placed near stoves to hold heat through the night. What they called it Gable's envelope, not as a joke, not with laughter, but with respect. Margaret stayed in her railcar for 3 more winters. Travelers began to climb the ridge just to see it. They expected to find a strange widow hiding in metal. Instead, they found a woman who had chosen to listen to the mountain instead of fighting it. She never claimed to be stronger than the men. She never said she was smarter. She only said she paid attention. Years later, when the railcar finally rusted through and the tracks were swallowed by weeds, the story remained. Old miners would sit by quieter, smaller fires and tell their grandchildren about the winter the blizzard buried everything. They would describe the wind that screamed like a living beast. They would talk about burning whole trees and still shivering. And then they would lower their voices and speak about the widow in the railcar who stayed warm with 3 small logs a day. Margaret did not survive because she was fearless. She survived because she refused to waste her strength on the wrong battle. She did not try to overpower the storm. She stepped aside and let it wrap around her. There is something in that lesson that reaches beyond one mountain winter. Sometimes we build bigger fires, louder defenses, and heavier walls. Sometimes we exhaust ourselves, trying to win against forces that do not care how strong we are. Margaret chose a different path. She broke the bridge that carried the cold to her bones. She built something that held warmth instead of chasing it, and in doing so, she turned what looked like a coffin into a sanctuary. If this story touched something in you, perhaps it is because we all face winters of our own. Not all storms come with snow. Some come with loss. Some come with age. Some come quietly, without warning. The question is not always how hard we fight. Sometimes the question is how wisely we build. Thank you for staying with this story. If you believe quiet strength still matters in this world, consider subscribing for more stories like this. And if you have ever found warmth in a place others dismissed, share your thoughts below. Because sometimes the strongest shelter is the one no one else understands.